What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Venom. So let's just get right into it because this is a really cool story. Now, we did finish Volume 1, but that was a little while ago. So as a little bit of a recap, and if you really want the whole thing, make sure you check out the Venom playlist where you can get caught up on Volume 1. All that's really happened up to this point is that in the aftermath of King in Black, Eddie Brock became the new King in Black himself, meaning he could control all symbiotes across the universe. Now, in doing this, it basically required him to leave his son Dylan behind on Earth so Eddie could serve a greater purpose. He left the main symbiote behind and told it to keep an eye on Dylan, but told Dylan not to merge with the symbiote. And so over the course of the story, different events transpired that ultimately led to Dylan bonding with the symbiote in order to basically escape with his life, because at that point in time, you had two groups that were hunting after Dylan and the symbiote itself. The first is the Life Foundation, led by Carlton Drake, which has long since been trying to hunt down and track symbiotes and use them for their own ends. And the other part of this is Alchemax, which is a really shady organization led by Liz Allen that's basically trying to do the same thing but for a different purpose. The long and short of this is that Dylan's basically being hunted continually by two different groups who want to kill him and take his symbiote. And so 13 days after the end of Volume 1, we pick up here where Dylan is in the care of a guy named Jake. Now, Jake is cool because Jake leads a group of bikers called the Renegades, but he's kind of retired from being a biker, if there is such a thing. The important thing about him is that he ran a pretty hardcore group back in the day. They did all kinds of crazy things, but the reality is over time, he's just sort of walked away from it all. And so he effectively retired from it, and he really kind of runs this section of a town. Now, there is a rival gang called the Hellhounds that are actually trying to take over the territory of Jake and his retired biker gang. Now, one of the things that had gone on here is that someone had attacked Lynn's forces, the guy who runs the Hellhounds. Now, of course, just by virtue of the comic, we know that it was Dylan who did it, but Jake doesn't know, right? At the end of the day, he just kind of has Dylan taking care of the bar itself and keeping an eye on things and making sure he does a series of small tasks and whatnot to earn his keep while Jake is taking care of him. But the funny thing here is Jake's also pretty jaded, because the reality is that Dylan approaches the area with a kind of youthful, maybe a bit of naivety in the sense of like, we can make this place better. But in a lot of ways, Jake has succumbed to his life experience and saying like, if you go out there and you fight that kind of fight against guys who want to tear towns apart or something along those lines, all that's gonna get you is like a bum leg, right? He's like, I've got a blown out eardrum. It causes you nothing but problems. So lay low, enjoy your life, and call it a day. It's one of the interesting things because it runs in stark contrast to everything that Dylan had been taught by Eddie, which is really the kind of lesson Peter learned from Uncle Ben. With great power must also come great responsibility. And so if Dylan can do something, he has the responsibility to do something. Hence the reason why he attacked the forces of the Hellhounds, because he's kind of dabbling in superhero antics to a degree, getting his feet wet in what it means to be a good guy. Now, for Lynn himself, he actually drags one of his guys into his office and they start spewing all this stuff, which as far as Lynn is concerned, is a bunch of babble and nonsense about how some monster or alien attacked them, the alien they saw on the news and different things like that. Lynn doesn't take it seriously and in fact goes after or really has this guy taken away and basically eliminated. For the most part, is, in no uncertain terms. He then tells his guys, get out there, do whatever you have to do, give me some answers, and I don't care what happens. And so where there is a little bit of discussion between the Venom symbiote and Dylan as to whether or not they should even stay in this town, and really Dylan wants to, right? Because he's like, we can protect this town. The Venom symbiote is just like, no, let's leave. It's not our responsibility to save every small town out there in existence. Now, to a degree, the symbiote's not entirely wrong, right? If every superhero tried to protect every town that exists in the United States, nothing would ever get done because there's just not enough manpower to do it. And so ultimately, Dylan just kind of boxes the symbiote in and is like, you are tasked by my dad to protect me. So I'm going down there. Now, whether or not you go down there with me is entirely up to you. But there's fires being set out there. There's innocent people in this town. We have to do something because the Hellhounds are ripping the whole place up. And so while you do have Jake and his forces where he's literally just like, nope, whatever goes on out there, we're not having anything to do with it. We're protecting ours and our own. This leads to basically Venom stepping in and attacking all these guys, right? Attacking the forces of the Hellhounds. Now, while that's going on, Bedlam sees all of it, and Bedlam heads to the direction of where Dylan Brock is. Now, Bedlam was introduced in Volume 1. He's basically a new symbiote. We don't really know a whole lot about him. And in fact, we'll talk a little more about his character here in a minute. I'm not going to leave you guys hanging in terms of information about him. I do want to wrap up this stuff with Dylan pretty quickly, but that basically leads to Dylan, of course, facing off against the Hellhounds. There is a situation, or there is a point where Jake comes head to head with Len, the leader of the Hellhounds, and they kind of invoke the old school way of doing things, which is we both lead two rival factions situations, you and I as the leaders will fight. If you knock me down and I stay down, right, you knock me out or kill me or whatever, then you get to do whatever you want here, right? But if I stand up, you leave this town and you leave my guys alone. It's one of the interesting things because I don't know if that's truly a biker standpoint, but I will say there is a little bit of honor in that. And so ultimately the two of them do end up fighting each other, but ultimately Len gets the upper hand on Jake and then Len kills Jake. And so that's when Len's forces get to basically do whatever it is that they want to do. Now the crazy thing about this is that while all this is happening and Dylan is trying to make his way to Jake in order to protect him, that Bedlam makes his move on Dylan and attacks him and overpowers him incredibly fast. Now, under any normal circumstance, this would be something that you would expect, right? Dylan is far less experienced in using the Venom symbiote than Eddie Brock ever was, but the truth about this is the Venom symbiote has all the experience of Eddie Brock. And so what the symbiote does is basically tell Dylan, let me run the show, I will deal with this guy. But even the Venom symbiote is overcome by Bedlam, and that's no small thing, because the Venom symbiote's gone toe-to-toe with some pretty heavy hitters. And the fact that Dylan, or really the symbiote itself, is being overpowered by Bedlam is an astonishing feat. Now, the symbiote does ultimately get the upper hand in the sense that it stabs Bedlam through the head and then basically walks away. But this is Dylan's inexperience in realizing symbiotes can heal from that kind of stuff. Either that, or he recognizes that's the case, but believes that in going to deal with Jake and his forces, it'll buy him time to get that whole situation sorted out and then come back to Bedlam. The problem here is that with Jake having been killed by Len, that now Jake's forces, it's open season. Len's guys open fire, Jake's forces are gone. And so in this moment, when Dylan is watching all of this happen, he literally gets there just a day late and a dollar short. Bedlam jumps back into the fray and attacks Dylan and then overpowers him and then literally starts punching a hole in him and then tells him, like, pain makes you stronger. Pain makes you better. Look upon my face and know pain. And that's when we find out that Bedlam is actually Eddie Brock. Now, here's the cool thing behind this, right? Because there's a lot more going on here than we're initially led to believe. So what this does is this jumps back to Eddie himself. Now remember, when Eddie had basically died in Volume 1, when he had contacted Dylan and said, meet me at this location and we will try to get you to a safe place, when he was killed in an explosion, sabotage essentially, that he woke up in this place called the Garden, which over time he learned housed other symbiotes, which were basically Kings in Black from different points in time, or we didn't necessarily know exactly what was going on with them. They were just other individuals who would go on to take control of the Venom symbiote, and all of it was led by a guy named Meridius, who is exceedingly ambiguous. We knew nothing about him, and we still don't know anything about him. He's just a guy who's there. We know nothing about this dude, but the entirety of the Garden is composed of symbiote matter and was created by Meridius himself. So whatever role this guy plays, he is exceedingly powerful when it comes to being able to use the symbiotes themselves. All Eddie Brock's been able to do as the King in Black is basically look through the eyes of all symbiotes that exist across the universe. This guy Meridius controls them all. He can do anything he wants with them all. It's a pretty astonishing feat. But of course, Eddie keeps having these visions of basically Dylan being in danger or Dylan being attacked or something along those lines, and it sends him into a panic attack. Because the truth about this is Eddie doesn't necessarily know where he is, but he can't escape where he is. And so because it sends him into a panic attack, he actually breaks free of the Garden and then falls through space and time and lands in an unknown location. And so what goes on here is the suit itself seemingly adapts to the place that he's in, where it starts feeding him information the way a computer would, right? It feeds back and answers him the way a computer would. But he's basically told that the location that he's at is on Earth, and that it's the 60,134th cycle, and that in Marvel Comics, a cycle on Earth is basically a year. He's in the year 60,000, the 602nd century. And he's just like, okay, this is crazy, right? Like, so obviously the Garden exists outside of space and time. And so it's wild, because as he's making his way through here, of course, he's set upon by a whole bunch of forces that tell him to surrender the symbiote itself for the Conqueror's glory. And so as he makes his way through this ship after defeating all these guys, he ends up coming across Kang the Conqueror, the guy who runs this entire area. And it's a really, really amazing moment, because as far as I'm aware in Marvel Comics, Venom has never fought Kang. And I don't even know if he's ever actually met Kang. And that seems to be the case here, because Kang greets Eddie Brock and it's just like, I know who you are. And in fact, they're coming comes a point where you and I meet, and I end up becoming one of your oldest friends. So yes, you are going to live far beyond a normal human life. And there's a little more going on there, and Kang will explain that. We'll get a little further into this as time goes on. But it's one of these things where Eddie Brock just refers to Kang as this guy that the Avengers fight sometimes. So they never really have a history together. This is cool. It's really, really exciting, because what happens, I mean, if this was Venom from like 1998 in Marvel Comics, I'd say, yeah, man, he's gonna get curb stomped by Kang the Conqueror. Kang the Conqueror, the guy who can manipulate time, yeah, Venom doesn't have a chance. But this is Venom from 2022 going into 2023. This is a guy who operates on a universal level. He stands a much better chance against Kang than he ever did. And that's the funny thing, is because what Kang does is immediately attack Venom. Now, it's more of a lesson than anything else, that Kang's not really fighting to kill. He's trying to push the capabilities of Eddie Brock in how he uses his Venom symbiote. And he even says that you look at the world through linear time, and you look at your symbiote in a very basic way. We're going to fix that. And so as they're fighting each other, Venom, or Eddie Brock, faces off against Kang using the same kind of fighting style that he would normally use if he were fighting Spider-Man, or for some reason he were fighting Captain America. Conventional weapons based on how he perceives the world. But Kang constantly pushing him and forcing him to think outside the box. That what he does is he actually uses the symbiote to conjure or to create the same kind of weapon that Kang is using. And this is when he starts to think differently. Now, this is a huge moment when it comes to the Venom symbiote. It's easy to look at this as just like, yeah, it's Venom fighting Kang. Cool, whatever. This is an instance where what Al Ewing is establishing is that Eddie Brock can use the symbiote to conjure arms and armament that are comparable to the person he's facing off against. So the question that you could ask yourself, and this is where the door has been open to this, if Venom's facing off against like the Silver Surfer, for example, can he conjure his own Silver Surfboard? Can he make a surfboard that's comparable to the Silver Surfer's? Not equal in power, because the Silver Surfer is powered by the power cosmic, and it seems like Eddie Brock can't necessarily duplicate that. But it is a phenomenal thing. It's a really, it just kind of pushes his shape-shifting abilities beyond taking on the physical form of something, and in fact, taking on the properties of the thing that he's using. And so in his fight against Kang, of course, Kang gets the upper hand, and that's when he basically tells Venom, what you did in doing this is the first step that you're taking into a much larger world. Sure, the weapon that you conjured was just a symbiote version of the weapon that I use, and so it was not equal to my weapon in power. But over time, it will be. Over time, your abilities will expand and they will grow. And so what he says is, if you'll excuse me, we'll get back to this, but I have to go to the little boy Conqueror's room. And so literally steps into his office, and he's met by Meridius. And what all this seems to be, Eddie Brock meeting Kang, this all seems to be the plan of Meridius himself. Again, a very ambiguous character. We don't really know anything about this guy. And so what it does is it picks up really with like a training session with Kang. And this is why I say, man, this is so cool. Kang sits down and trains Eddie Brock. And what he says is, okay, much like what I told you before, you're stepping into a much larger world. You are now using your symbiote to not only allow you to dodge the spider sense of Spider-Man, different things like that, but to take on the properties and principles of various things that you can duplicate. In a lot of ways, Eddie Brock is learning to use the symbiote to become very similar to like Vanessa Carlyle, right? Copycat from Marvel Comics. Copycat is very similar to Mystique in the sense that she can shapeshift and take on the forms of other people. The difference between Copycat and Mystique is that Mystique can only copy their form. Copycat can copy their powers. But where Kang is kind of helping to push the understanding of Eddie Brock in terms of his physical powers, he's also doing this in his relation to understanding time. Now, one of the things that Kang is doing here is he's actually trying to allude to Eddie something bigger's going on. He's not being obvious about it. He's kind of handing him these little bitty clues, but he's helping Eddie piece the picture or piece the puzzle together of what's going on with Meridius without saying, hey man, so like here's exactly what's unfolding. A lot of this seems to be predicated on the idea that if Kang did that, Meridius would kill him. But one of the things that Kang the Conqueror does, and this is a genius maneuver by Al Ewing, because one of the things that he says and really answers is the question, why doesn't Kang just go back in time and like stop Steve Rogers from getting the super soldier serum, kill Abraham Erskine early, and like deactivate the bomb, or like push the Incredible Hulk or Bruce Banner out of the way of the Gamma Bomb so he never becomes the Incredible Hulk, destroy or kill the spider that would bite Peter Parker? Why doesn't he like go back in time and do these little things that stop different superheroes from coming into existence? And this is answered as Kang is explaining time to Venom and saying, there are some things that happen in this universe that you can't stop. There's no conceivable way you can keep that from happening. That much like Reed Richards finding the Council of Reeds and Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four, Peter Parker will always be bitten by a radioactive spider. If Kang the Conqueror were to go back in time and stop the spider from biting Peter Parker, he would just be bitten by a different one. He may become a different version of Spider-Man, but he will always become Spider-Man. Steve Rogers always becomes Captain America. That's seemingly how these things always work. Now, this is largely Al Ewing ignoring stories like House of M, for example, where Steve Rogers never becomes Captain America. So it's largely Al Ewing kind of ignoring that and focusing more on how things transpire in the main Marvel Universe. But with this information, what Eddie Brock realizes is that him transitioning from the Garden to the 602nd century in Kang's ship means he can travel through time. He can move back and forth through time. But one of the things that Kang tells him is understand that when you move back and forth through time, it's like having invisible rubber bands on you. It's always going to try to pull you back from where you left, right? So Kang the Conqueror, for example, when he leaves the 31st century and goes to like the 20th century, time is always trying to pull him back to the 31st century. Because of his technology and his understanding of time, he knows how to work around that limitation. Eddie Brock does not. And so as a result of this, Eddie Brock actually leaps into the time stream, and this is when we end up finding out a lot of the things that are going on here are happening because of what Eddie Brock had done. For example, Archer Lyle, who meets up with Dylan and then ultimately betrays him, Archer Lyle just arrives where Dylan is in Volume 1 because Eddie Brock traveled back in time and sent her an email telling her, you need to go find Dylan. That's the reason why Archer appeared out of nowhere. Eddie sent her there. Now, of course, Eddie was under the belief that because he and Archer were such close contacts back when he was a reporter, that Archer was still a good guy. Effectively, Archer turned against Dylan and tried to hand him over to the Life Foundation. Of course, following Dylan's capture in Volume 1, when Eddie appears out of nowhere in kind of this mangled conglomerate of like different symbiote forms and starts talking to Dylan, that was Eddie transitioning through time and arriving in that moment, only to find Dylan is basically being held by the Life Foundation after being handed over by Archer Lyle. And that's when Eddie learns Archer betrayed Dylan, which is something that he never thought was really going to happen. Now, what's also ironic about this is that he in turn basically tells Dylan, I can fix all of this. For the moment, I will free you, but you are going to have to find a way out of here, right? You're going to have to get out of here on your own. And so what happens is, traveling back through time, he finds a body or a version of himself that's just waiting to be taken, right? There's a moment in time when his body's just laying in a bed, which is the perfect time for him to inhabit that body. That is the body, or that's the Eddie Brock that called Dylan in Volume 1 and said, meet me at this location. Now, of course, the funny thing about this is that at that point in time in Volume 1, there were two Eddie Brocks walking around. One of them was the Eddie Brock that called Dylan up on the phone and says immediately, don't say the name. Don't say dad, right? Just tell me that you found it and everything's okay. There was another Eddie Brock that was walking through the house. This version of Eddie here in this moment right now, traveling through time, realized the version of himself that was walking through the house was actually Meridius pretending to be Eddie Brock. And so once he realized that, that's why he told his son, do not say the word dad. Otherwise, Meridius will realize that you're talking to me and he'll kill you or he'll immediately come after me, but things won't happen as they're supposed to. Now, of course, once that call is made and he's expected to go meet Dylan, of course he does. That's when he basically perishes or appears to die, and that's effectively it, right? He wakes up in the garden. But of course, at this point, as he's traveling through time, Meridius realizes what he's doing and literally grabs Eddie himself and throws him and locks him inside the mind of the Bedlam symbiote. And so Eddie Brock is witnessing everything the Bedlam symbiote is doing as it's attacking Dylan when Dylan was trying to save Jake at the beginning of this story. And that's what's crazy, is because that's when Eddie realizes the Bedlam symbiote is himself, but it's Eddie Brock when he was like the steroid abusing Eddie Brock back in the 1990s in Marvel Comics. And so this is a really cool moment, because what Al Ewing does is he takes all this information and he reconciles it together. That there comes a point when, as Eddie Brock is watching Bedlam attack his son, Eddie Brock absolutely screams and manages to escape the mind of Bedlam and wake up in the garden. But when he does, he emerges as Finnegan. So if you guys remember in Volume 1, you had one of the Kings in Black who seemed like a fool. He seemed kind of stupid, right? A little bit of an idiot. And he in turn like was attacked by Bedlam. Bedlam hated him and then just kind of sent flying. That was Eddie Brock, right? That was Eddie Brock escaping the mind of Bedlam. And so what ends up happening here, because I know a lot of you guys are probably a little confused. You're like, all right, there's a lot that's going on here. What Meridius does and what Al Ewing does is he explains all of it. And he says, all these different Kings in Black here, Eddie, are you. They're just different points in your life. Finnegan is the version of you who comes to this realization after I explain it to you that they are all told you. He's the version of you that's insane because you can't handle the truth of what I've told you. It's why you seem so goofy and so silly. Bedlam is the version of you that experiences anger and rage. You eventually transition beyond Bedlam into another one, and into another one, and into another one, until you eventually become me. I am the end result of what you will become. That you have all these different paths, right? You have 7 paths, 7 stages that you're going to go through. Now, here's the kicker about this, is because what Meridius tells Eddie is that I am your 6th version, right? I am the final version of you. But Eddie realizes there's 7 paths, which mean beyond Meridius, right? After Meridius, the most evil version of himself, that Eddie is going to find another version of himself, seemingly the most powerful version of himself that he becomes. There is a 7th symbiote that exists out there. What form that takes, what version that is, we do not know. But seemingly it is beyond anything and everything that makes Meridius what he is. What level of power this will be, I have no clue. But what I will tell you guys, I am excited to find out. The work of Al Ewing is amazing here. It's probably one of the greatest runs on Venom that I think I've ever seen. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.